Hello, you're listening to Send in the Experts with Georgina Durrant. This podcast is all about teaching and supporting children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND. I'm Georgina Durrant. I'm the host of this podcast, brought to you by Twinkle SEND. As a former teacher in Senko myself, I wanted to create a platform to share some of the amazing things that my guests are doing to support learners with SEND. So whether you're listening on your commute, tuning in whilst walking your dogs, or curled up on the sofa with a nice cup of coffee, thank you so much for joining us. Today I'm joined by Catrina Lowri, who is the founder of Neuroteachers, an autism and neurodiversity research, training, mentoring and coaching company. Catrina is neurodivergent herself and is passionate about finding simple solutions for inclusive practice. Hi Catrina.
Hello.
So we've followed each other on social media, I believe, for a little while, but this is the first time we've actually met, and I'm really excited to be talking to you. Are you having a good week?
Well, do you know, it's good to be the end of term. Mm-hmm. It's been probably the most stressful and unusual term that we've ever had in my 22 years of teaching. But yeah, it's going okay.
Yes, I can imagine. So I wanted to start by talking about your experience of being neurodivergent yourself. The podcast is called Send in the Experts, and I thought it was really important that we recognise that the experts in SEND aren't just experts because they've studied various diagnoses or taught children with special educational needs, but the real experts are those who have diagnoses themselves. And you sort of span both of these because you're neurodivergent and you're a qualified SEN teacher, previous Senko, etc., etc. So if we first talk about your childhood, when did you realise that you were neurodivergent?
Well, yeah, I have Esther Ranson to thank.
Okay.
So when I was around about 8 or 9, Esther Ranson's daughter got diagnosed with dyslexia.
Yeah.
And there was a program on around about sort of like tea time called, I think it wasn't That's Life, it was another one of hers.
This is Life or something like that.
This is Life, yeah. And she was on there once, so she was talking about her daughter. And my brother and I were watching it, and we'd always had quite different experiences of school insofar as I've always had really good general knowledge, but reading and writing, I really struggled with, and it just seemed like, gobbledygook to me most of the time when I was a child. And my brother, who's 16 months younger than me, mm-hmm. was way ahead of me, like streets ahead of me. And yeah, I sort of knew I wasn't really stupid, but I felt like there was a difference. And my brother said to me, this is my recollection of it, my brother said to me, oh, well, that sounds a bit like you, Trine, actually. And so we went to speak to my mum and said, we've just seen this program about this thing called dyslexia. And then, my mum sort of went, oh, no, it's very rare, because at the time it was the 80s and that's what people thought. But eventually they decided to get an educational psychologist involved. And he was this man called Dr. Carl, who was a very stereotypical looking, with a beard and, grey sort of wavy hair and half moon glasses, who did these series of tests. They were like these puzzles, because, obviously, like, it's a psychometric test, and mm-hmm. it just seemed like doing a load of puzzles. And then at the end of it, he wrote this big report on me, which I still have, actually.
Oh, do you? That's interesting.
Yeah, it is. It's really interesting to read, actually, which said that I was dyslexic, and that, basically, although my vocabulary was at about the age of 13, because I knew words like carcinogenic and ecclesiastical, but I couldn't spell the word honey.
Right. So there's a real difference between...
So basically it was that classic patchy profile. Yeah. But it being the 80s, my head teacher's reaction was to put me in the remedial class.
Right.
Which meant that I had to go to this little shed down the bottom of the school field, which was really cold. And I had this lovely woman called Mrs. Solly, who was delightful. But basically, we just seemed to do quite a lot of colouring in and handwriting. And it didn't really massively help. But also as well, the other children in the class called us the REMs, which is pretty disgusting if you think about it now. But, it was the 80s. It was a crazy time. And so that was like the help that I got given in school, was to go and sit in a shack at the bottom of the school field. My goodness. And it was really cold. I can't emphasize how cold it was to you. And then my parents basically, I mean, I'm in quite a fortunate position. My parents are quite, they've got decent jobs. They're both psychiatrists and doctors. So they had decent salaries, so they were able to pay for me to have private tuition.
Yeah.
So basically from the age of around about 10, pretty much all the way through my A-levels, I had at least one private tutor for one subject or other.
Yeah.
And I didn't have any specific dyslexia tuition, but that was what helped me. And then I did get extra time in my GCSEs and A-levels, but it wasn't really until I went to university, I had this amazing dyslexia tutor called Tanya, who just explained how my brain worked to me.
Wow.
And she was awesome. She was amazing. And it pretty much changed my life. She pretty much persuaded me that I could actually be a teacher as a dyslexic person, because I was originally a modern languages teacher as well, which people think is quite unusual for a dyslexic person.
I was going to ask that. Yes, that does seem an unusual choice perhaps, but not for you.
Well, no, I mean, my main subject, my degree in my original PGCE is in German, and German is a phonetic language.
Mm-hmm.
So I found I could spell better in German than I could English.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's a phonetic language.
Absolutely.
French wasn't so easy, but I'm quite an auditory learner, so I do pick languages up quite quickly, and I can just hang around with some Korean people and I'll pick up the odd word, that sort of thing. It's just a thing that, because I'm an auditory learner, it actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And there are a disproportionately high number of dyslexic people on my modern foreign languages course at uni. So
yeah.
I've never studied that. I mean, to be honest, I've never really studied dyslexia very much because I am dyslexic. And then the bipolar diagnosis didn't happen until I was 32. I had quite a significant manic episode I didn't actually get diagnosed. I was 32. I had a significant manic episode when I was 22. I had a car crash, and it just sort of, it was, and PGC's years is stressful enough anyway, but it just, because I came out of it really well, it sort of triggered some delusions in me that I was now impervious.
Oh my goodness. So the car accident was the trigger then for...
Yeah, it was the trigger for the manic episode.
Gosh.
And I probably had some mania before that, but it wasn't anything that was severe enough to be medicated. But for that one, I was actually hospitalised for about 2 weeks, and then I was a day patient for about 3 months. That was, the health service was much better in those days, though.
Yeah. So as a child, the bipolar, you weren't aware of that
I was aware of it insofar as I did have kind of what I would now describe as hallucinations, but I just felt like I just thought everyone else was seeing what I was seeing.
Yes,
so I didn't really know.
Yeah.
My perception of the world was somewhat radically different. And I think that that's kind of why it's appealed to me to kind of get really involved with the autistic community, and why I decided to study autism is because a lot of the sensory experiences that have been described to me by autistic people are very similar to what I experience.
Yeah.
I mean, I probably have some kind of sensory processing disorder alongside of the lovely kind of fruit salad of my own neurodivergence. I'm only diagnosed with 2 conditions, but I probably have more than that.
Yeah.
Because, statistically speaking, there's a 70% chance that if you have one neurodivergent condition, you're going to have another one or more. So there's a lot of things that kind of it resonates with me.
Yeah.
Autism. And that's throughout my teaching career, I kind of meandered into special needs. I didn't have a deliberate path.
Yeah, I was looking at your sort of career history, and to be honest, it's similar to mine, because I was a science teacher, then I was a deputy head in science, and then I went into being a Senko after that. And it's sort of a similar route to you in the sense that you were a modern foreign languages teacher, then you became head of history. Is that right? And
I've been head of German, head of year, all sorts of things.
Brilliant. And then from that, you decided you wanted to become a Senko, is that correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, what it was, there was one particular child who, shall I tell you the story?
Yes, no, I've written this down, I think you've mentioned it in something else that I was going to ask you. Is this Colin, a year 8 student called Colin? Is this the one?
Yeah, so I met this year 8 student called Colin who, he had a global delay and autism. He was in a mainstream year 8 class, and they were difficult class. There's 32 of them. I had every kind of need in there. Plus I had quite, because we were right by it, Heathrow Airport, so I had quite a lot of new arrivals as well. So I had some kids from Kosovo, and it was, they were a lively bunch. And I didn't have a TA or anything in there, but I had Colin who was in the old fashioned sense statemented, and one of his targets was to learn to copy.
Yeah.
So I thought I had it sorted because I'd, not been qualified very long. And I was like, right, know exactly what to do with Colin.
That confidence that you have as like a new teacher when you cracked it. I've
been teaching 2 years. I know everything now. So we had the words up we had some fruit, 6 fruit up on it was an overhead projector. That's how long ago it was.
Nice.
And some pictures of fruit, and then underneath the word in French, and he had to copy the word onto the worksheet where I got done the pictures, and he had to copy the words, and he was right at the front. And I told him what to do, and I walked off, and his head was down, and he was writing, and I was all chuffed because I was like, yeah, definitely. And then I went back to go and have a look at what he'd actually written.
Oh, no.
And he'd written a word that started with F underneath each one of the words.
Oh, dear.
Which was not what I put on the board, by the way. I just want to make it clear that I didn't put that word on the board. And I said, Colin, you were supposed to copy the words. And he said, yeah, I did copy the word. And he pointed to where someone had carved with a compass on the desk, said F word in really large writing.
Oh, bless him. So he'd done what you asked, really?
He'd done what I asked. He said, copy the word. Just didn't say where the word was, did I? No. I had made it very, very clear that I wanted him to copy that word and not the word that was right in front of him. And this was the word that was nearest to him. So he copied that one.
How did you handle this, Catrina? What did you say?
Well, it was immediately at that point that, my youthful exuberance about the fact that I knew everything about teaching after 2 years of teaching kind of like went out the window. I thought, oh my God, I don't know anything. Yeah. So I basically said, thank you, Colin. Right. I gave him the next piece of work. I took what he'd done down to the Senko and I said, how do we fix this?
Yeah.
And she found it hilarious. And everybody found it hilarious, and they didn't really help me. And so I just thought, right, okay, well, I've got to do a better job with giving instructions because I'm clearly not giving instructions properly. And then I changed the way I did that. Now, when you're a languages teacher, you have to do quite a lot of, levez-vous, asseyez-vous, or steht auf, setzt euch. It's very,
yes.
You are very demonstrative anyway, but I started to put that more in. And then I would always check back in with Colin that he knew what he must do exactly down to the detail. And I just got much better at my instruction giving and my questioning.
And did that work for him after?
It did work for him. He did all right in the end because it was right by Heathrow, like I said, and he got a job packing boxes in the airport.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Which you can earn decent money from, and he actually really enjoyed. So, he turned out to be all right in the end. But I would say, Colin definitely changed my life. And that was what made me want to go into special needs. But I had no idea how do you become a Senko? How do you get into special needs?
Yeah, I don't think you're told the route. I definitely wasn't told a route. I don't know if there is a route into it.
No, so to speak. I think
people seem to meander into it or find their sort of calling in a sense, don't they? They have that moment like you had and think, actually, this is what I want to be doing. This is the difference I want to make. Do you think being neurodivergent yourself helped you want to be a Senko? Do you think it helped you when you were a Senko? Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, as I say, from the moment I met Colin, I wanted to understand, and then there was also another child quite early on in my career who had ADHD, and I was really interested in finding out how his way of experiencing the world was, how his brain worked and everything. And I became quite interested in brains to an almost nerdy sort of level fairly early on. And, found all of that really, really fascinating. It's really interesting because I know virtually nothing about dyslexia. Like, as a dyslexic person, I don't know virtually nothing about bipolar. I never research or read anything about those two conditions because it's my lived experience. Yeah. Whereas if you, dyslexia, so autism, ADHD, other neurodivergent conditions, I'm absolutely fascinated by, and I can't absorb enough information. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I sort of always really had a kind of affinity to autistic students. And I always felt like I really learned a lot from them. Yeah. Their perception of the world and I like the honesty. I like the honesty.
Yes.
I like the fact that you're definitely going to get an honest answer out of things.
I
and I like the
agree.
humour involved.
I once had, it just reminded me, I had an autistic student in my class when we had an Ofsted inspection when I was like a young teacher. And we'd had the Ofsted inspectors in quite a lot because we were a school in special measures. And the kids would normally, as they do, just sit there. An Ofsted inspector would come and sit in the back and no one would say anything because they understood. And there was one autistic little boy who was sat there, and the inspector sat down and he said, "What are you doing in our classroom?" It was brilliant. And I thought, not one child of the however many children I have taught has questioned why we've got an observer in the classroom. And this good on him. We need somebody to say it because everybody's thinking it. Why is somebody in our classroom? It was just the best question. And yeah,
I love that. It's like, I know, I love that. I mean, like, I also as well, I would like to also actively encourage people to go and teach in schools that are on special measures or on RI, because you get so much more training and so much more experience in those schools. And like, you get the best sort of like
training.
Training. You get tons of training.
Absolutely.
It's amazing. Second only to be working in a pupil referral unit, I would say, in the level of training and the level of you properly learn your craft.
Absolutely.
Like that.
What year of teaching were you in when your school was in special measures then? Were you in, because I think I was in...
That was the one with Colin. That was my second year.
Yeah, I think we were similar.
They made me head of German and I was all fresh-faced and 23, you know?
Brilliant. Yeah, no, it was similar for me in that, I was a very new teacher, school in special measures, and actually I learned so much because I think the good thing was the expectation on me wasn't that high because I was a new teacher. So you sort of learnt, you just were able to be a sponge and just suck up all this training and learn so much from the people that came in. Yeah. Now you've got all this experience with special educational needs. If you could go back in time, what support would you have liked as a child? And do you think it would have made a difference if you could go back in time and give yourself that support as a dyslexic child? What would you have wanted?
Oh, yeah, I would have liked Tanya, my university dyslexia tutor, to come back and help me at the age of 9. Because I was like, I was labelled as a REM, I mean, like how offensive is that now? The thing is, I always laugh about it, right? My therapist always says that I always just use humor when I get to tragedy, but I do find it quite funny because it's just like, it's so ridiculously offensive and old-fashioned.
Like, how did it happen? Now. Yeah, how did they get to where we've been able to say that?
How did they even think it was okay to label kids that, And it wasn't just the teachers, it was the other children as well. So, what I would have really liked would have been acceptance and also somebody to say to me, do you know what, like, you might, your reading age might be quite low and your spelling might not be that great, but at the end of the day, you're going to end up with a master's degree and a 21-year teaching career and a highly successful business. And if somebody could have told that 9-year-old me that I would have, I've written 2 research papers, regularly write blogs. I mean, thank God for technology, to be honest, because I write everything with voice to text.
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, I use voice to text. This is the thing, right? I don't write stuff. I get my voice to write things, and then I get my laptop to read it back to me, so I can check all the typos and mistakes that way. And that's how I write everything. And I write it really quickly then as well. It's about twice as fast as typing anything.
That's fantastic.
And so, the other thing is as well is I would have liked somebody to tell my 9-year-old self that's okay, there's going to be tech that will help you.
Yeah. And it's a shame at the moment, isn't it, that there is that tech out there and it's not being always utilised effectively for students. I know sometimes it is, but not everyone's got access to this when it could be helping dyslexic students.
Well, no, I think that's the thing about it is in terms of teacher training in neurodiversity. So Wales is a little bit ahead insofar as they're going to make it compulsory that everybody has, as part of their initial teacher training, some training in SEND and neurodiversity. And this is going to have to be updated yearly, annually, so that everybody has the most recent research and thinking and everybody feels kind of empowered. in England, we don't have that sort of like compulsory. You need really at least an inset day a year. I mean, it wouldn't have to necessarily be 6 hours and there's all your send done sort of thing. I think it should be a drip effect where you have, a twilight here and there sort of thing throughout the year. So it's on your mind. But a lot of the time when staff can't do stuff, it's because they genuinely don't know what to do. Like, they don't, like, differentiation is, a drum we've been banging for a good 20 years now. And nobody taught me how to differentiate. I just used to make tons and tons of different worksheets. That's exactly what I was going to say. I think when in my teacher training, differentiation was about, here's a worksheet, let's make 5 copies of it. And that's not differentiation, really, is it? No, not really.
I was going to ask you as well. So you've published 2 articles for the Good Autism Practice Journal. I've read your first one from 2018, which was on extreme demand avoidance and ADHD. Really, really interesting. And one part that stuck with me was it said, if ASC EDA is not understood, staff can perceive demand avoidance as a moral choice and resort to punishment and sanctions rather than support and positive intervention. And I found that quite difficult reading, if I'm honest. It's upsetting, isn't it, that can happen, and it does happen, that people see it as a choice, that children are misbehaving when it's not their choice. So could you just define for our listeners what extreme demand avoidance actually is?
Okay, well, since I wrote that, my thinking on this has changed. But then this is the point about research, isn't it? Is that in the light of new information, your thinking changes. So the National Autistic Society describe extreme demand avoidance, otherwise known as pathological demand avoidance, as a subset of autism, whereby children have extremely distressed behaviour, emotional dysregulation, and this can cause extreme, unusual, and it's described as being mercurial insofar as there will be rapid changes in the mood or behaviour and presentation of the child. Now, the thinking is, there's somebody else who I follow on Twitter who has really changed my ideas about it. He's an autistic writer called Richard Wood, who talks about demand avoidant phenomena. Insofar as his argument is that it's not just something that autistic people experience, but other people with other neurodivergent and actually, to be honest, neurotypical people can experience a demand avoidant phenomena, which is caused by extreme stress or trauma. And I think demand avoidant phenomena kind of really works really well as an idea, because I think I've certainly been demand avoidant at times during my life. I have 2 neurodivergent conditions. I have one severe mental health condition, and I can be a bit demand avoidant, if I'm honest with you.
So to this article then, if you tell us about it, there was a boy called Jack. It centres around a boy called Jack.
Yes.
What were the strategies in place put in for him then? Can you just summarise what it said?
Well, initially he had a diagnosis of autism, but he didn't, and they were looking at ADHD at the time when I just got in with him. But what we realised quite quickly is because the TA in the class was very skilled with autistic children. She'd worked with a lot of different autistic children. She had a high level of training. The teacher was an NQT, which was amazing. She was like you said, she was like a sponge. She totally absorbed everything really quickly. So we realised quite quickly that the autism strategies were not working. The typical autism strategies are things like having timers and having now next boards and visual timetables in the traditional sense. And using, the teach approaches where you had kind of like closed tray work activities and a workstation was just not working at all for him. And his main thing was that he liked to pretend to be a tiger, and he couldn't use a pen because he had tiger paws. And, there were various things like that where he would get stressed, and you would have to, the way in which the teacher just automatically learned this is that you had to kind of go into his world and become part of what he was doing. So if he was being a tiger, you had to be a tiger with him. And as long as, you could carry him out, and then you could bring him back out and he would calm down and become, usual Jack, who wasn't so much of a tiger anymore. And then, so we did the extreme demand avoidant questionnaire, which is written by Liz O'Nions, which is available on my Facebook group in case you would like a copy. And he turned out to have quite a high level of demand avoidant behaviours going on. And the paediatrician agreed that was something that would be useful as a descriptor. It's not a diagnosis as such, but it is a descriptor of behaviours. And that gave the school the confidence to ask me to do some training with them, first of all in basic autism strategies, and then also in demand avoidant behaviours. And then we wrote what I call a consistent behaviour support plan, because the idea is that all adults would use the same set of strategies with Jack. So every adult in the school that was likely to come into contact with him, and that meant, the receptionist, the midday supervisor, everybody, and it was a very small school, only had 11 staff in total, very small countryside school. Everybody knew the strategies that you use, but because he's demand avoidant, you couldn't necessarily say that this strategy would work in this case and this strategy would work in this case. What you needed was kind of like 10 strategies, and today you'll do 2 and 7, and tomorrow you'll do 3 and 8. So, I describe it as being consistently inconsistent. So everybody had like a plethora of different strategies. Today we're all being tigers, for example. So everyone who comes into contact with Jack, he's being a tiger, so we're all going to be tigers today. So all the adults in the school were going around growling and having paws and fluffy ears. So I think once everybody understood the most important thing about demand avoidant phenomena is that it comes from a place of fight or flight. It comes from a place of stress. Autistic people have a third more cortisol than neurotypical peers, and people who have demand avoidant phenomenon have even a higher level of cortisol. So basically they're wallowing around in stress most of the day. So everything that they do is distress behaviour.
It's quite upsetting, isn't it, when you think about it?
Well, it is, but you see, the thing is, if you know that and you understand that, you've got to assume that he's stressed unless you know he's calm. And using, Damien Milton, who's another really great autistic writer, who I've learned a phenomenal amount from before, says, basically explained in one of the lectures that I was in that you have to assume that an autistic person is stressed unless you have very good knowledge that they're not, in which case they might be, like, for example, asleep, in which case they probably aren't stressed. But if they're awake, then they probably are a lot more stressed than you are. So if you assume that, and you're always going for de-escalation, and you're always going for calm, and you're always trying to get them to that calm alert state, then you're probably going to be okay.
That's really interesting. So just for our listeners, cortisol is the stress hormone, isn't it? That's the
yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's a higher level in autistic people.
Yeah, so cortisol is that kind of like fight or flight hormone that comes out it's really useful if you want to run away from a bear, but it's not that useful if you've got a maths test.
So these strategies that you put in place for Jack, did they work? Was he happier in school as a result of it? Were you able to follow it up?
Yeah, no, it wasn't quick. Okay, this is the other thing about none of these strategies are quick. Right, we've got to get rid of this idea of this 6 to 8 week cycle, because in my experience with children who have highly distressed behaviours, it's going to take a year. Okay, so we did reduce incidents. We reduced incidents quite significantly, relatively quickly, but it didn't get down to absolutely nothing ever. But he did manage to complete the rest of primary school without having a fixed term. And he only had one fixed term exclusion when he was in year 7. And to be honest, that was Christmas week. So, but he's in secondary school, and he's doing really, really well.
And the transition for him to secondary school, were you able to follow that and see how that went?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't directly working with him by then, but I work with his secondary school. So I'm, and also as well, I got to know his mother really well in this situation. And she's a former head teacher too. So, so he had a very clued up bunch of adults around him. There's a family history of autism. So the whole family kind of knew what was going on and understood that. So, I'm a relational practitioner. In that case, it was very easy to be relational because absolutely everybody was on board from day dot. So that makes it much easier. It's not a hard sell then, is it? When everyone's going, do you know what? We really need to reduce exclusion for this child because he's been excluded loads of times. He's only 7. So if everyone's going, yes, that's absolutely what we need to do, then it just makes my life a hell of a lot easier because I can go in and say, okay, well, I know how to do this. So let's try it.
Do you have many where that isn't the case, where parents or the teachers or whoever aren't on board as much as you would like?
Well, it's the thing is like, so my most recent paper is on persistent absence and autism. It's not available for general release yet. If people want a copy for informational research purposes, then they can contact me through my website, which is www.neuroteachers.com. But basically in that, it's so my whole kind of mission is to reduce exclusion to a point where, it really becomes unnecessary. Okay. Now, I have and ahed about this. And I think at the moment we can't completely do away with exclusion because we don't have an alternative. And there are some very, very extreme cases where the child needs to be not in that school. But until we have a good alternative for that, it's going to, unfortunately, I come to the conclusion that it has to remain as a final thing. But I would like there to be less than tens of kids a year. At the moment, there's 8,000 children a year being excluded. And there's, we're getting up to around about 100,000 children a year who are having persistent absence. So persistent absence is any absence which is over under 91% of full attendance. So, it's something like 15% of kids at the moment are experiencing persistent absence. It's obviously got worse because of the pandemic, and it's much worse amongst neurodivergent children, and 43% of the children who have persistent absent or autistic.
So your second paper is about sort of autism and anxious non-attenders. So what do you think the link is between autism and the attendance, basically?
I think it's about the anxiety. So when, I did a talk about this in the summer, which was called Everyone Gets Anxious. And the thing is that so you were asking me about schools and hearts and minds. And the thing is about it is everyone does get anxious, and teachers will say that out of the goodness of their heart, because they're talking about being a bit anxious about your driving test. They're not talking about persistent, long-term clinical levels of anxiety, right? When we have a child who is persistently not attending, it is because they have, the statistics tell us that mostly it's because of anxiety. And often this is because of school-based trauma. And that is a very difficult pill to swallow as a teacher, because we love our kids. We go into teaching because we love kids and we really want them to do their best. And if you're a secondary school teacher, it's because you love your subject. And if you're a primary school teacher, it's because you love your age group and you love your kids and you look forward to seeing them. And even though you're absolutely exhausted in the holidays, you miss them, right? And when one of your kids is not turning up, right? This is the reason this happens is because it's very difficult to be reflective. So we get hammered all the time, teachers, don't we? The press is just always after us. The government will always blame teachers. Goodness me, every week there's some kind of headline. So it's a tough job to do because everybody's got an opinion about it. And then, one of your kids stops turning up. It's all too easy to either blame the kid or blame the parent, right? And that's what the data tells us, is that most teachers would have the perception that it's either a problem with the child or it's a problem with the parents. Okay, but if you survey the parents and the kids, they will tell you the reasons are to do with mental health, which is usually school-based anxiety caused by a trauma at school, or to do with sensory needs.
Yeah.
Okay, so the problem is that it's not going to work to get the kid back into school because we've got two massively different opinions.
Everyone's not on the same page there at all.
Nobody's on the same page. So you're already off to a bad start. Okay. So once you get them both on the same page, and you have to accept someone's lived experience. As a neurodivergent person myself, right? If I tell you that I'm having an experience, it's because I'm having an experience. Okay. So you've got to go with people's lived experience. So if that parent and that child tells you they've got mental health problems or sensory perception problems, then that is what you have to, that's the first thing you have to do, is accept that is true. Okay. The second thing to do is that it's going to take time. On average, these interventions that I do with these kids take a year. Okay. Now that's average. Okay. So in my study, it was between 6 and 22 months.
It's probably a lot longer than most people are expecting.
Exactly, because they think that the kids are going to go back after 6 weeks because they had an exit card and someone met them at the door.
Not gonna work. Or if it does work, it's probably not going to work in the long term. It could be a short fix, and then it's going to happen again.
Yeah, there's no such right. Okay, you cannot do this quickly. It has to be long term. You have to take your time over it. If you really want to get that child back in full time, then you're going to need a year, right? And you're going to need to have a plan that both the child and the parents agreed to. And the third thing that is really, really important is that everybody needs to be relational. So even if you don't like what the parent is saying, and you don't even like the parent, you don't agree with their parenting choices or anything, in front of that child, as far as you're concerned, you're completely on the same page. And if you're the parent and you think the school's doing a terrible job, right, in front of the child, you need to be saying, they're doing a great job, they're doing everything they can for you, I totally trust them. Because if the child gets wind that this party doesn't trust this party, then it's not going to do anything to reduce their anxiety.
Absolutely not. That's really interesting. Really, really interesting. So is that something you do as your day job then? Are you working with schools and working with children and working with families and trying to help with sort of attendance?
Yes, mainly. I mean, the main part of my work at Neuroteachers is intensive support. So I'm either working with kids who are close to exclusion, or I am working with children who are doing what I call self-excluding due to extreme anxiety. And, I have, largely speaking, I work online these days, but I do go to schools. I'm quite happy to come into schools as long as, COVID restrictions. But, I've had international students. I've got one that I'm working with in Italy at the moment. And I've got a few other, Canada, Middle East. But generally speaking, it's the UK. And, I'm working to try and improve attendance. I'm trying to get kids back into school because that's where they want to be. I mean, I do training as well. Obviously, I do massive amounts of training and events on these subjects. But my kind of day-to-day very often is working with individual children and the teams around them. I mean, I'd like to be doing much bigger pieces of work, like maybe across academy trusts or across local authorities, to try and really improve to lower exclusion of all the kinds. And that's coming gradually. But I think it's just ever so important. And both exclusion and persistent absence are just massively on the rise now, and it generally is the neurodivergent and autistic community who are really having the brunt of this.
Do you think the pandemic? I know obviously the pandemic has caused problems with attendance for that reason, but do you think as well it's impacted on autistic children in particular in changing their routine, changing all of that side of things? Do you think it's made it your job needed more in a sense?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm inundated, but still, call me. I mean, right. So, for example, I did a Q&A a while ago, and there was one particular school where they sent along one of the special needs teachers, and they said, okay, well, the thing is, like, she stopped attending since the pandemic, and she doesn't really understand why she can't have her lessons online. And I'm like, okay, well, can she have her lessons online then? They went, oh, well, we're not doing it anymore. I was like, well, you did it before. Were you doing blended learning before? And they said, yeah, we were actually. And I said, okay, well, could you just do that? And at least then she's attending in some way. And they did it. And guess what? She started attending. And that's the thing is that
it's almost like you're saying the obvious thing to it. I like it because it's the obvious answer, but it's probably not the answer that they thought of. You're saying, do you know what I mean? That is the reason why she was attending before. It's a huge change, but because we've all sort of dealt with these big changes of the pandemic and things going back to normal and things going back again, we don't sort of think about it from their point of view. She's seen that school can work that way, so why can't it work that way now? It's obvious, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it is. And also as well, she's autistic. Autistic people are incredibly good at logic, and that's a completely logical thing to do. I mean, it's completely logical for her. She's too anxious to be able to come into school. There has been various variants. She's a bit scared to come in, and also the sensory overload of going from being at home to being in school is too much for her. She's told you all of this. She's very eloquent. She's at a secondary school. She's a bright mainstream kid, and she's told you exactly what she wanted. So why don't you just give it to her? And it worked. And then she did come in for certain events and things. So, that was a relatively easy fix. But the thing is about it, right, it's like, again, right, we are under duress as a teaching profession. We have been for years. Okay. It's bad. Okay. This has been the worst term that I've ever known. And when you are stressed, it's very difficult to be curious.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So back to cortisol and back to the kind of sensory system and the window of tolerance. it's not just your students who have a window of tolerance and you know, the stress hormone cortisol. You have them too, right? And your window of tolerance is going to be extremely open in September when you've just had a 6 weeks holiday, and very, very tightly shut in the last week of term. Okay. So you're going to say no. Yeah. Okay. And it's not your fault that you're saying no, right? It's just that you can't imagine things when you're stressed. You can't think
just do one day at a time, just surviving.
Yeah, because we were all doing that at the moment. We've all, like, literally the entire nation has had a massive adverse experience. You know, we've all been through a huge trauma, right? It's still going on. There's still a pandemic. We're looking at Omicron now, aren't we? And and so in that, give yourself a break. Right. If you need somebody else to come in and say something blindingly obvious to you, it's because I'm not as close to the problem as you are. So, it's not that difficult for me to come in and say, okay, well, have you tried this? Because I can sit with fresh eyes, and I'm not as close to it as you are. So I can be a bit more objective. And the other amazing thing about being dyslexic is you get the helicopter view. So one of the good things about being a dyslexic teacher is you can see things in a much broader sense. So I can look at the conduit parts of something and say, okay, well, what if we move this around like this and this and this? And that's why, that's why it's great to be a neurodivergent teacher, is because you see things
and that's what people
differently.
need, isn't it? Like you say, people are stressed. It's no reflection on their practice if they are struggling. It's just, it takes somebody else's eyes, doesn't it? And somebody else's point of view who might be less stressed and less under pressure at the moment to be able to go into that situation and say, actually, have you tried this? I think that's really important.
Yeah. And it's just like, I look at sort of like, I get people's behaviour, the schools that have that C system and they have like a behaviour system. And I look at her sheet of, she's had 12 things in a day. And I look at it and I think, well, one of them was for rolling her eyes. One of them was for being sarcastic. I'm like, actually, do you know what? That says that is the teacher being stressed. Okay. That's not persistent disruptive behaviour. That's the teacher being stressed. So let's go and see if we can deal with this teacher's stress first and foremost, right? And the problem is that you are there day after day after day, and your timetable is unlikely to have that you have a free lesson once a day. It's more likely that you're going to get six period day on one day, and then the next day you've got like half an hour, you've got an hour. Do you know? So you don't get a break. So sometimes you've been teaching for days and days and days straight, and then some sarcastic little child like rolls their eyes at you, and you think, right, that's it. I'm giving a behaviour point. Right? It's understandable at that point that you might not have the best judgment. So let's deal with the teacher's stress. If you deal with the teacher's stress and you're given an opportunity to debrief and say, oh my God, it's hard, isn't it? And say, look, this is really difficult. The job that you're doing on a day-to-day basis, you get up, you come here like 7:30 in the morning, you're here till 6 o'clock at night, you're putting the hours in day after day after day. It's okay if you find it hard, because it's hard.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Really, really important. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk to you about was your new YouTube channel. I've been watching it. I've seen there's 2 episodes so far. I don't know if there's been any more since I last looked, but that I would recommend to anyone who's listening to have a look at them, because they're really, really interesting. They're short and snappy, and they give real life examples of situations and things, ways you've dealt with them. And I just want you to talk. Could you tell us about your first one? So the first one is It Doesn't Matter, They're Autistic, and it's about a little girl called Kylie, and I found that one really interesting. I wondered if you would tell the story.
Yes. So I've worked in several special schools, but this particular one was really close to my heart. So I worked in a special school, which was a straight through school. So this was a woman. She was a young woman. She was just about turned 18. And she was a really lovely, non-speaking, autistic girl who was a really friendly, good laugh, really just the sweetest, kindest girl. But she was very tall, right? She was kind of built like Serena Williams. She was a big, tall, strong, athletic girl, but just the loveliest, sweetest, kindest, just a wonderful character that we all really liked. She's great fun and everything. Anyway, her behaviour really rapidly changed over the course of a week. And no one could get near her, and she was throwing chairs and pushing people off her, and she usually be a really huggy person, and she was not at all. And she was just like, she was just really real change in her behaviour, and no one could really understand why. And then eventually got to the point where she ran out into the playground and she was grabbing handfuls of gravel and rubbing them into her face. And So we called a doctor, and the doctor just took a look out the window and went, "Oh well, yeah, that's autistic behaviour. She's autistic." And then just got in his car and drove away. And the thing is, like, we knew that she was autistic because it was a school for autistic children. So, hey, guess what? She's autistic like all the other 300 kids that are here. But also as well, we knew that that wasn't the usual behaviour for Kylie. So eventually 2 members of staff managed to get her into their car. They had permission from the mum, so they took her to A&E. They managed to take her temperature, and she had a temperature of 40. It turned out she had a really chronic urinary tract infection, and she'd been rubbing the gravel into her face to cool herself down. Yeah. So this was a sensory behaviour that was very, very unusual. She got better. She didn't rub gravel in her face anymore. But you see how the kind of moral of the story is that behaviour is communication. And in that case, when you work with, this is another thing, I think it should be compulsory really to go and work in a special school for a couple of years. Because when you work with these kinds of kids, especially non-verbal children, you can learn so much about communication from a non-verbal person. Irony.
It's true though, isn't it? Absolutely true that you do.
Yeah, and I've worked with non-speaking kids. Like, I had to do a handover when I left my last job, and I was speaking to somebody about this child, and I've been speaking to them for like 10 minutes before I realised that he was non-speaking, and I hadn't told them because I was just so used to, like, we communicate through other means. I think that's lovely.
That shows that the child. You know what I mean? And you care about that child, because that isn't the obvious thing to say about them at that time. You're just thinking about them.
Well, yeah. And then what I'm doing with this, the YouTube channel is the first kind of like series of 10 is going to be like some little case studies of kids that I've worked with, and it's mainly about sensory and what you can learn from their sensory needs. And I feel like the things that I've learned, the kids teach you things, right? It's a teaching and learning process. And I have learnt more from my autistic learners than I have from any lecture on my my master's course in autism or anything that I've read. It's understanding. When you understand it, like, you can hear the story of an actual individual, then it really brings it home. And it's it's a small YouTube channel that's really, really growing, and I would love it if people would come and watch it. So it's neuro teachers on the YouTube channel, and they're really short. They're kind of like between 1 and 3 minutes long, and hopefully you get some information and you understand a little bit about what the autistic experience is like.
What struck me was how good they would be for training at schools, as part of like a Twilight, or just as like a staff meeting, and just show it, because they're so short and snappy, so people don't have very much time, do they? But put them on and then discuss them afterwards. And what I love about everything you do is it's all centered around children. Your articles, your blogs, your website, everything, your YouTube channel. It's not talking, because you're a very clever lady, I can tell, but it's not talking about like the specifics and the theory. It's always bringing it back to the child, and that's what it needs to be, isn't it? It's bringing it back to that child and these examples and how it actually affects that child and what we can learn from them. And I'm going to ask you to spoil your YouTube channel by telling us, could you tell them about Ben? Because I loved this one about concentration. I just thought that was beautiful.
He was just amazing, and an absolutely amazing artist. Like, you could just, like, he was a visionary, right? That's how I describe him. He was a visionary. So he's autistic, year 10 boy, and he just wasn't concentrating in geography. And his geography teacher really liked him and couldn't understand why on earth he didn't find plate tectonics the most fascinating thing in the world. So I was asked to go and observe him, and he was just kind of having this amazing sensory experience where I demonstrate it on the video.
I love the way you demonstrate it. People need to go over to the YouTube channel and look at the way you do this.
I would love for you to see this, but it's just like I can't do this on a podcast. But he's staring into the middle distance, but following the dust particles round, because there's there's the projector that works on the smart board, and it's obviously got 3 different colours underneath it as well. So that's why the picture on the front is like this rainbow dust, right, on the picture on the blog on my website. He's getting really involved in this whole universe of the dust coming out of that, and probably like thinking about pieces of art he can do and how he can draw them and everything. And I can't emphasize enough what an amazing artist he was, but he wasn't concentrating on the geography, which his geography teacher felt he had a good chance of getting a good GCSE in, and it was a means to him getting onto his art foundation course eventually. So we had a look at what was going on, and I have to emphasize to you, so Ben's concentration was excellent. It just wasn't concentrating on what Mr. Drake wanted him to concentrate on.
I love that.
He was concentrating on the dust.
And he was probably concentrating more than anybody else in the class.
Yeah, he probably had the most tremendous concentration of anybody in that entire class of 30, right? It just wasn't on geography. Okay. So what we needed to do was, firstly, he needed to regulate insofar as his sensory system. He was kind of what you would call hypersensitive. So insofar as he would hyposensitive, not hyposensitive. So his sensory system was a bit like, he was a bit of a low registration kind of a child. So he would go into daydream, but these daydreams were phenomenal, right? And also very useful to him. So you don't want to stop them completely. You just want to get him out of it enough for him to be able to concentrate in geography. So we gave him some sensory activities to do before his lesson, and also if he needed to during the lesson. And that just brought him back into his window of tolerance so he could be calm, alert, and ready to learn. So that I explain all that in the blog, and it's also on the YouTube channel. And then we also gave him joint attention. So he loved like Marvel characters and superheroes and things like that. So the teacher would kind of like bring little pictures into every single worksheet or every single slide. He put these little bobbleheads around the classroom. So Ben would look at the front of the class and go, oh, look, it's, it's Captain Marvel. Oh, look, it's so-and-so. It's other well-known characters from films. And that would just like, he would find it funny because Ben had an amazing sense of humour, and Mr. Drake and him did have a really good relationship with each other. That's the thing. They did really like each other, and it really, really worked very well. So he would just think, right, okay, so how can I like get this child in? Right. So he just tiny little pictures or tiny little things, and he'd see how quickly Ben could spot them, and it became a competition. And then Ben would be like, oh yeah, this is really good because I'm going to have this game to play when I go to geography. I love geography and I love Mr. Drake. And in the end, he ended up getting a decent GCSE and he got onto the next course. Brilliant. So it worked really, really well. But it just goes to show that, like, again, just having somebody else to come in and say that this child is concentrating really, really well. He's just not concentrating on what you want him to do. And we can do a lot about that.
I love it. Absolutely brilliant. So people wanting to find you, because I'm sure people will listen to this will be inspired and be wanting you to help them. So where can they go? What should they be doing? Where can they find you?
Okay, so I have a website, which is www.neuroteachers.com. And that has the blogs on it, which each of the blogs has a link also to the YouTube channel. Well, a lot of them have a link to the YouTube channel, but also there, if you want to find out about events, so if you're interested in anxious non-attenders, demand avoidant phenomena, or anything else that I've mentioned in here, just general differentiation for autistic children, distress behaviour, and so on and so forth. I have various different events for that. I have the YouTube channel, which is called Neuroteachers. I have a Facebook page and a Facebook group, which is called Neuroteachers. My Facebook page has all of the blogs on it, but I also put lots and lots of other resources and materials on there. So there's loads of stuff for demand avoidant behaviour on there, and there's social stories. There's all kinds of information on the Facebook group. I'm on Instagram as well, as it's Neuroteachers UK. I'm on Pinterest as Neuroteachers UK, and I'm on LinkedIn as Catrina Lowri. And also I'm on Twitter as @Neuroteachers. Yes, I talk a lot on Twitter because it's very short, and I like things which are very short and brief, which is why my blogs will not take you more than 3 minutes to read, and neither will my videos take you more than 3 minutes to watch, because I know that teachers are time short and they need the information now, but they also need it in a nicely presented, nice short way that tells you about a child. And I always say you need to think about the child in mind. Yes. So when you come to me, bring a child in your mind with you, and I will talk to you about how to work with the child in mind.
Thank you so much. You've been an absolute wonderful guest.
Thank you. It's been really lovely to meet you.
Thank you. Wow, wasn't she interesting? I could have chatted to her all day, and I don't know about you, but I feel like I've learned so much in the last 50 minutes. So Catrina did list all of her links, but in case you missed any, her website is www.neuroteachers.com. Thanks again for listening to Send in the Experts with Georgina Durrant. I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, share on social media that you've been listening along, and maybe even write us a little review. See you next time.